All right. Well, it's so good to see you all. Welcome to our second session of our discipleship class through Neil Shenvy's book, Why Believe. Um, Today we're continuing on in our book. We finished chapter 1 last week where we talked about why even ask the question, why believe? Today we're continuing on as we explore whether or not the Christian story is true by talking about the trilemma. So before I start, let me go ahead and open us up in a word of prayer. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you for this time. I want to thank you for the grace of your love. And God, for the opportunity to read a book that tells us and teaches us and helps us explore questions of faith and think about what are the reasons why I believe what I believe and how does this make sense of our world. And so, God, I pray that you would bless this time as we explore the question of the trilemma and the reliability of the Bible. And God, I pray that you would teach us and help us grow more confident in you through this time. I pray this by the power of your Spirit and in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. So before we can argue for the truth of the Christian story, we must first know what the Christian story teaches. The fundamental question is, who is Jesus and what does he say about himself? That's the question that every human being on earth needs to at some point answer. Now, most people have a thought about who Jesus is. In fact, most scholars agree that Jesus was a real person who actually existed. Most people even like some of the things that Jesus said. You'll find it very hard to find either an atheist or an agnostic, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, or even a Jewish person who dislikes Jesus. You'll be very hard for you to find someone like that. Most agree that Jesus is a good man who taught to love your neighbor. They say we can like Jesus without believing that he is God. But our lesson today is that we cannot simply write away Jesus as a good teacher. C.S. Lewis explains this to us in what has been called the Trilemma. So what is the Trilemma? Well, C.S. Lewis, when he was in World War II, was asked to come on the radio in the UK and talk about faith. They were very depressed. It was a very hard time in history for the Allies, especially as the UK was under what was it, the bombardment? I can't remember what they called it. What is it? Yeah, they were under attack. They were being attacked through the air all the time. They constantly having to go in bunkers. And so the government actually asked C.S. Lewis to come on the radio and encourage them with the faith. In a series of lectures he gave, became known as, or were eventually collected into a book that we know today as Mere Christianity. And Mere Christianity would be remembered as one of the greatest works of apologetics in the history of the church. And in that book, he gives something that has become known as the trilemma. He didn't call it the trilemma. Later, Christians call it the trilemma. But I recorded the trilemma in y'all's notes, and I'm going to go ahead and read it. He says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. This is what C.S. Lewis says. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. You see, this goes back to last week's teaching. We said that we cannot consider our thoughts about Jesus as being only of moderate importance. We must honestly consider the person of Jesus that we find in the Bible and make a decision about his identity in our hearts. If the record of Jesus in the Bible is true, then we cannot leave this conversation at the idea that Jesus is merely a good moral teacher. The options that the Bible presents us with, based on what it claims about who he is that he must either be a liar, that he was being intentionally deceptive about who he was. He said he is God, but he's not right, that he's lying. He's a lunatic, which means that he thinks he's God and everything he's saying is earnest from his own heart, but he's wrong about it. Or he's actually the Lord of creation. Now, my case is that, or at the journey, we believe that the story of the Bible, and we've been talking about this as we've preached through John, and if you go back and review our series through John, it makes very clear the story of the Bible is unequivocal that Jesus is the Lord of creation. You can't get away from reading statements about him being the great I am, being one with the Father, being the Word in the beginning, who was there when the earth was created, who through him all things were made. Jesus makes very bold claims about who he is. But our challenge today is not necessarily interpreting what the Bible says, but rather, how do we know that the Bible is even a reliable way of knowing what Jesus claimed about himself? Neil Shenvi, recognizing this issue at the outset, starts his case for the truth of Christianity with defending the reliability of the Bible. Is the Bible a reliable source of revelation about Jesus? If it is, then the consequences of it are significant. The consequences of this book called the Bible are significant. Now, what about those who don't think the Bible is reliable? What do they say? How do they make sense of this book that we hold in our hands? I think it's good that we know what people who have different perspectives on this teach. Many what we call critical scholars who come from non-Christian camps will argue that most of, if not all of, the writings about Jesus' life were fabricated decades after Jesus' death and far away from Israel, far away from Jerusalem, where he claimed to do his ministry. The stories, according to these scholars, were written and made up as a legend for a growing religion called Christianity to justify its beliefs. So the problem that we're going to address today, and I'm going to quote Shenvi saying this, consequently, in order to restore the relevance of Lewis's trilemma, we must make a case that the Gospels provide a generally reliable portrait of the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth. So we're going to do that by covering 6 major areas that Shenvi covers in his book. First is manuscript transmission. Second is non-Christian documentary evidence. Third is geography. Fourth is archaeology. Fifth is the Jewish context. And sixth is a field of study called onomastics. And don't let any of those 50-cent words scare you away. We'll talk through the meaning of them in a little bit. So first, we're going to start with the reliability of the manuscript transmission. It's sometimes claimed that we cannot trust the Gospels. The Gospels are the accounts of Jesus in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because we only have copies of copies of copies. That's the claim. We only have copies of copies of copies. Now, I don't actually have time to dive into a full argument for why the transmission of the Bible is reliable. But we do have a 45-minute lesson on textual criticism from our sermon series through John that you should go watch. If you go to thejourneyhouston.org/sermons/textual criticism, you can find our lesson when we covered the woman caught in adultery in the book of John. And the link is there on your handout as well. But to summarize that lesson, the reality is that the transmission of the New Testament is well attested. Far more than any other ancient document, in fact. We have several thousand manuscripts spanning several hundred years. It says several hundred centuries in my notes. Several hundred years that prove the transmission process was reliable and accurate. Now, while there are variants, you'll find if you open up your ESV Bible that you probably brought today, and you look at the bottom, you'll find that there are variants. There are some manuscripts that say different things than other manuscripts in some verses. But the differences between manuscripts are insignificant and can be explained very easily. But here's the next, but we continue on from this idea of textual transmission or textual criticism, because a reliable transmission doesn't prove that the things that happened in the Bible are actually real and historical events. A reliable transmission of Harry Potter through the centuries doesn't prove that the events of Harry Potter are actual history. So let's examine the corroboration from outside the Bible that proves the content of the Bible is historically reliable. So the second thing we're going to cover is corroboration from non-Christian authors. We can learn the basic facts about the real history of Jesus' life and about the movement he founded from extra-biblical sources that corroborate the Bible's claims, that confirm that the things that happened in the Bible actually happened. It's like when you see something on the news, you can corroborate it by checking with other news sources, especially if they're disinterested parties, if they're parties that don't have a vested outcome in what is happening, confirms whether or not that thing is actually happening. Same thing in history. Shenvi says, exclusively from non-Christian sources, these are non-Christian sources, we can learn the following. We can learn that there was, in fact, a Jewish man named Jesus who lived in first century Judea. We can learn that he had a brother named James. We learn that he was called the Christ or the Messiah by his followers. We learn that he did some kind of seemingly miraculous deeds. We learn that he was brought to the Roman authorities by the Jewish religious leaders and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, who is mentioned by name in these writings. We also learn that the movement that Jesus founded was first checked by his execution, meaning that people largely went into hiding, but later re-emerged and spread as massively and as far as Rome. The early Christians, we learned, chanted to Jesus as if to a god and refused to worship other gods even on pain of death. They met regularly, shared a communal meal, and pledged to live moral lives. We can learn all of that from reading extra biblical sources, from reading pieces of writing in history written by people who were not Christians, who were not vested in proving that Christianity was true. We learn all of those things. So the comparison this also means that the comparison between Jesus and, let's say, a legend or a fairy tale is inappropriate, because when you talk about a legend or a fairy tale, you're talking about once upon a time. The historical context for those kinds of stories are meant to be more of a setting for the more important story that you're trying to tell, and it really doesn't go much deeper into history than that. But our story is not just once upon a time, it's historically situated in the reign of such and such a king like Herod the Great, on this day and time and event that happened, that several non-Christian witnesses could corroborate that these things happened in real history. So this was something that happened in real history with real people that are named and mentioned in the Bible. Okay, so we can say that the writings of the New Testament, they're not totally made up. They're not totally based up on some made-up history. But couldn't it be more like a legend like the Iliad, for instance, which is a Greek myth that's loosely based, that most scholars today would say the events in this story didn't actually happen, but they were loosely based on a real war between Greece and Troy, something like a historical fiction or something like that, something that was based in that time period. Well, Shenvi says no, because while legends can be based on some history, the enormous amounts of subtle details in the Bible about Jesus' historical context that are corroborated by geographic, archaeological, and other historical studies are way too vast to simply be a legend. So first, Shenvi examines the corroboration from geography. From references in the New Testament, we can conclude that the authors of the Gospels were either familiar with the geography themselves and general history of Jesus' life, or they were relying heavily on those who were. You see, knowledge of relatively minor geographical details and features would be difficult to obtain without some first-hand knowledge of the time and place of Jesus' life. Therefore, the authors of the New Testament had to have first-hand knowledge of the time and place their books were written. What we're trying to do is attempting to show that it's more likely that the authors were genuine eyewitnesses who could faithfully record the events of Jesus' life and the subsequent church expansion, rather than an author of a fiction story writing and making this up many decades later. So one way, for instance, to tell the difference between a genuine gospel account of Jesus' life as an eyewitness and maybe actual fake writings about Jesus. So we have actual false testimonies of Jesus we call the Gnostic Gospels, for instance, Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas. One way that we can tell the difference between real Gospels and the fake Gospels is the fact that those fake Gospels only have very, very few and very general and vague geographical references. On the other hand, Mark's Gospel, for instance, uses 24 distinct place names, and Matthew and Luke combined reference 11 unique geographical locations. And so the question Shenvi asks is, could 24 geographical references emerge from a game of telephone played over 2,500 miles with thousands of participants over the course of decades? He says, my suspicion is that a game of telephone involving even 50 people passing along a single sentence in a single auditorium entirely in English over the course of an hour would fail to preserve a single unfamiliar geographical place name. So his claim is this is no mere legend. The people who wrote this story were very familiar with Jesus' homeland. So next is corroboration from archaeology. Shenvi says archaeology provides dramatic corroboration of the Gospels. Minor historical and geographic details in the text have been corroborated through archaeological discoveries. And these are not just that this city or town existed in the ancient Near East, in ancient Israel, ancient Palestine at the time. We're talking about examples such as the pool at Bethesda, the pool of Siloam, the synagogue at Capernaum, inscriptions naming Pontius Pilate, who was a relatively minor governor of a small province, the prefect of Judea, inscriptions naming Lysansius, the tetrarch of Abilene, in a first century house from the village of Nazareth where Jesus grew up. These are very small geographic locations that have been corroborated by archaeology today. Would someone who lived far away from Jerusalem know of these very specific and very personal places? We see even more examples if we include the book of Acts as the church is growing. We see the Temple of Artemis has been discovered, the theater in Ephesus, the Mars Hill in Athens has been discovered, the Forum Appiae has been discovered, inscriptions of Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, has been discovered, and inscriptions of Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Cyprus, have been discovered. And then two that are being debated to this day are some discoveries that could be the ossuary of the high priest Caiaphas and potentially the house of Peter in Capernaum. An even more interesting example of historical confirmation is the use of regional titles for government officials in various locations. The authors of these Gospels, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we include Acts as being written by Luke, who wrote the Gospel according to Luke, they use very specific names for government offices that we have verified through archaeology were actually what these very small towns and very small places actually called their leaders. For instance, the rulers of Cyprus and Achaia were proconsuls. Ephesus was administered by a temple warden, a proconsul, and asiarchs. The magistrates of Philippi were praetors, and Thessalonica had politarchs. And in Malta was ruled by someone called the first man of the island. And Shenvi explains why this is so important. He says, imagine trying to write a fictional account of a diplomat's journey through Southeast Asia. How accurate would you be in correctly naming the various regional officials, prime ministers, presidents, kings, and governors that you might encounter? Unless you either had accompanied the diplomat yourself or relying heavily on the account of people intimately familiar with that region, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to reproduce the correct titles. The odds are more likely that Luke was a competent and reliable historian of events that he witnessed firsthand. Next is corroboration from details about the Jewish context. It is unlikely that later fabricators would have been so familiar with Aramaic words and phrases, so familiar with Jewish religious details, and so unconcerned about the absence of Gentile circumcision, which we'll explain that one in a second. I know that one sounds weird. First is Aramaic words and phrases. Most scholars believe that as a first century Jew, Jesus would have spoken Aramaic. Although the Gospels were written in Greek, there are a few places where the specific Aramaism that Jesus used when he was actually speaking those words is recorded by the author. And the author explains what it means to his Greek audience that he presumes wouldn't understand. A famous example is when Jesus is on the cross, and Mark records that Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, or Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? Shenvi says one has to wonder what incentive or ability Mark would have to insert such words into his narrative if these stories were fabricated outside of Palestine several decades after the events of Jesus' life. And second is the Jewish religious details. There are several places where the authors of the Gospels need to explain to non-Jewish readers very specific religious practices and their significance, assuming that their audience wouldn't understand them. The actual fake Gospels, so we talked about the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, for instance, Gospel of Peter. In those books, they don't explain. In fact, they rarely ever go into explanations of Jewish practices in the time of Jesus' life. But the author of the real Gospels had to have had a first-hand experience of very specific religious practices during a very specific time in a very specific place in history, information that if they were making this story up would have been easier to leave out, since most of their audience is not going to care about it and wouldn't want to dive deeper into it. Shenvi says the best explanation is that the Gospels so clearly reflect a first-century Palestinian context because they have accurately transmitted stories from the life of a first-century Palestinian rabbi, Jesus. And thirdly, this one seems odd, but if you think about it, like Shenvi says, it's very powerful, that there is little discussion in the Gospels about the Gentiles being circumcised. Now, it would take too long to explain the theology behind this, but Israel's sign of the covenant they had with God was circumcision. In the New Testament, on the other hand, the heart is circumcised by the Holy Spirit, and Gentiles are part of the church without needing to be circumcised. And in most of the New Testament, the contentious issue in the church, whenever there's Jewish people and Gentile people are involved, is whether or not the Gentiles in the church needed to be circumcised. If a book was written by Christians later on in the church's history justifying their beliefs, wouldn't this be a central issue that the author would be trying to pick a side on? In fake gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, this is a central issue, which we would expect from a book written around that time, but not in the biblical Gospels. So it seems, based on these evidences, that the author had to be very familiar with the Jewish people and their specific time and place in Jesus' life. A feat very difficult, perhaps not impossible, but unnecessarily difficult for someone to undertake who simply wanted to fabricate a story. Now, finally, is the last piece of historical corroboration for the historical reliability of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. And this one is unique to Shenvi's book. I haven't heard it offered by any other book in apologetics. It is corroboration from onomastics. What is onomastics? Onomastics is the study of the history and origin of names. A few decades ago, a historian compiled a database of hundreds of names drawn from burial boxes of Jews born between 300 BC and AD 200 in Israel. What scholars have discovered is that evidence from onomastics data matches the names in the Bible to the time of Jesus' life. We learned, for instance, that the most popular boy name at the time was Simon, and the most popular girl name was Mary. And not only do the most popular names in the Gospels match the most popular names in the time period, but they also match the percentage of usage as those onomastics data discovered. So the conclusion is, if the non-Christian scholars are right, that the Gospels and Acts were written outside of Israel a few decades after the events they narrated, then how likely is it that they were able to utilize the statistically highest occurring names of actual Jews during Jesus' time on earth? That would be like me asking you to write a story about the 1970s and accurately use the most popular names from that time period in the statistical percentage of usage that they had. Very low. So based on that information, for the stories to be made up, the authors would have had to have such detailed knowledge of the history that of those most statistically popular names. They would have had to have knowledge about historical figures from several different places in the world that were very niche and not very popular around the rest of the world. Their proper titles, the nuances of a foreign language, and religious practices from a very specific people in a very specific place far away from where they lived. And then that person had to seamlessly and subtly weave that information into a fabricated story. And in many cases, all that work and information would have been unnecessary if you were really making up a story. In fact, so unnecessary that actual made-up gospels did leave all that information out. So the most plausible explanation is that the events that occurred in the Gospels are actual historical events being relayed to us by actual eyewitnesses of those events who had a first-hand experience of those people, places, and culture, painting a generally reliable portrait of the historical words and actions of Jesus of Nazareth. But as Shenvi says, therein lies the issue. The trilemma returns to us. Jesus really existed, and the record of his claim is reliable. It's unlikely that these were simply words attributed to him in the future. Jesus really said the shocking things that he said. One cannot read these words and come to the conclusion that Jesus is merely a kind and compassionate teacher. We spoke about why earlier. Jesus claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, the ruler of Israel. He claimed to be able to forgive sin. He claimed to be the only way to God. Jesus is presenting before us the idea that he is the central figure in the true story of the whole world. He says that he was there in the beginning of the story. He is the author of the story and the hero of the story. These are metaphysical, life-changing, worldview-altering claims. If Jesus said these things, which we have good reason to believe he did, then we must decide, is Jesus a liar, a lunatic, or Lord? If he is who he said he is, according to his own words, we need to reconsider a lot of things. Our allegiances, our philosophy of life, our careers, our spending habits, perhaps are more difficult for our culture, our autonomy, our identities, our orientations. We must surrender all those things to him as Lord. But despite the hallmarks of a historically reliable document, many still dismiss the historical nature of the Gospel's narratives. Their reason is not necessarily historical, we've covered the history today, but rather philosophical. Their reasons, they say miracles are impossible, and there are miracles in the Gospel accounts. So next week, we're going to explore the greatest miracle of the Gospel accounts, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And on that miracle, the truth of the Christian story rests its case. So we're going to take some time. Y'all have about 7 minutes to discuss the questions in your closing table discussion. Sorry I didn't leave y'all with as much time. But we're going to take some time to talk about those questions together, and I'll bring us back around 4:15.